In my video, The Introduction to Doubting Darwin, we looked at how distorted theism has had a tendency to encourage atheism. Homer's gods on Mount Olympus created the same distaste for supernaturalism in ancient Greek skeptics as did the corrupted supernaturalism of Christendom for Enlightenment and modern era skeptics in Western civilization. It was in this context, between 1859 and 1871, that four men, Charles Lyell, Charles Darwin, T.H. Huxley, and Ernst Haeckel, provided the desired unbible stories for life. Let's begin by identifying the biblical concepts for life that were targeted for demolition by the men of the Enlightenment. Then we will focus on the items specifically attacked in Charles Darwin's view of life's diversity in The Origin of Species by Natural Selection, published in 1859. The Bible identifies three distinct ideas about life that materialistic naturalism contradicts with opposite stories. First, the Bible says that the living God created or made vegetation, various marine and terrestrial life forms, and humans, which means biogenesis. Life came from a living source. To contradict that, between 1868 and 1874, T.H. Huxley, Ernst Haeckel, and Charles Darwin speculated that life arose from non-life, or inanimate matter, by natural processes alone. This is called abiogenesis. Second, Genesis says that separate and distinct major kinds of life forms appeared at about the same time, and Paul said that there are different kinds of flesh. Secularism's opposite story imagines life as a unity, a single tree, with all later forms arising from an original simple protozoa, with major groups gradually emerging from earlier groups at different times. The diversity of life story appeared first, with Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species by Natural Selection, published in 1859. Third, Genesis portrays humans as a special creation, in God's image, and man when they appeared. Secularism's opposite view, humans are not special, just another animal. Charles Lyell and T.H. Huxley published books asserting that humans probably evolved from the great apes in 1863, with Charles Darwin's version, The Descent of Man, published in 1871. The Enlightenment had a valid complaint against Christendom's distortions resulting from later Roman emperors trying to use Christianity to salvage the dying empire, and Darwin had a valid complaint against the notion of no biological variation borrowed from Plato's Great Chain of Being. Limited biological change can and does happen, and the artificial breeding of dogs and farm animals yields observable variations. This form of biological variation within larger kinds was not a new discovery, because Genesis 30:31-43 describes Jacob using this to create his own flock before breaking away from Laban. Darwin was also correct that if biological variation could occur artificially, then why couldn't it happen naturally? However, because Mendal's study of genetics was not published until 6 years after The Origin of Species was published, and rapidly gaining acceptance, Darwin wrongly imagined variation to be unlimited, which caused him to also imagine that all life could have been gradually transformed from protozoa, including humans. Imagining that single-cell protozoa had been slowly transformed into new, widely differing body formats, pikes, pythons, porpoises, parrots, poodles, porcupines, and pachyderms, Darwin needed a plausible-sounding mechanism capable of morphing protozoa into all of those larger and more complex body plans. To produce biological change, new shapes and body parts, He adopted Lamarck's earlier idea of inherited adaptations. It was imagined that an original short-necked giraffe began reaching for higher leaves and actually stretched its neck a small amount. This slightly stretched neck was then passed on to its offspring, which stretched their neck a little further, and this process continued for many generations until the neck of the giraffe had extended to its current length. Well, that sounded plausible, and it was good enough to get Darwinism 1.0 off the ground and widely accepted for the next 60 to 70 years. In the 1920s, Hermann Muller performed experiments in which fruit flies were bombarded with X-rays, and this demonstrated that radiation could produce mutations, such as new body parts, like extra eyes and legs and wings. So between 1936 and 1947, a shift occurred as inherited adaptation was replaced by random beneficial genetic mutation, as the mechanism by which protozoa had gradually been structurally transformed into all of the other major body plans. This marked the release of Darwinism 2.0, which came to be known as Neo-Darwinism.
It remains true to say that we know of no way other than random mutation by which new hereditary variation comes into being.
Along with morphing life forms, Darwin also needed a sorting mechanism by which the less fit forms would be deleted and replaced by the newer, more fit forms. Natural selection was the logical assumption that nature would favor, sort out, and select the most fit life forms in the competition for resources and mates. Whatever was bigger, faster, smarter, and so on would win the struggle for life. It was also logical to believe that the selected most fit forms would produce more offspring and eventually replace the less fit. Some even promoted natural selection as all that was required to make the Darwinian story work. Well, some evolutionists assert that there is evidence for their story right outside your window. In 1874, Darwin's zealous German promoter, Ernst Haeckel, claimed that many life forms looked almost identical in their embryonic tailbud stage because they were repeating their evolutionary history from their common ancestor. He published drawings showing the almost identical embryos of fish, salamanders, turtles, chickens, rabbits, and humans at the tailbud stage. It was even claimed that human embryos passed through a fish stage with gills on the neck. Some thought this might be the best proof for Darwin's story, and the idea and drawings began appearing in textbooks in 1901 and continue to be found in textbooks to this day. Building on Haeckel's embryo story, it was claimed that structures such as legs, wings, and hands continue to look similar in various adult forms because they have a common evolutionary heritage. This came to be known as homology, or comparative anatomy. A century before Darwin, Carl Linnaeus had arranged life forms by similar structural characteristics. Darwin imagined life radiating from protozoa into different groups like a branching tree, and in the 1870s, Ernst Haeckel produced a more detailed version of the imagined branching tree of life. From Darwin's original notebook sketch, evolutionary tree artwork has continued to appear. Taxonomy tree charts are the visual portrayal of the Darwinian tree of life scenario. Protozoa are the first life at the root and trunk of the tree. As you move up the tree, you come to branching points, where a common ancestor split into two or more branching lines. The branches then represent the separate lines in which intermediate, transitional forms were gradually changing into the distinct and different life forms we now know and recognize at the end of the branches. It was assumed that the human body might have a number of currently non-functioning leftovers from earlier evolutionary forms, still visible, but in the process of slowly fading away. Influenced by Huxley, Lyell, and Darwin's books on human evolution, in 1882, the German anatomist Robert Wiedersheim claimed 86 vestigial elements on the human body. By 1925, Horatio Hackett Newman more than doubled that number, offering testimony in the Scopes trial that there were 180 vestiges in the human body. During Darwin's voyage on the Beagle, he noticed a number of varieties of finches in the Galapagos Islands with different beak structures, and it was assumed that all of the varieties came from an original finch that made it to the islands. It was asserted that the British gray peppered moth had evolved a new color, from a light gray to a darker gray, so it could better hide from predators on tree trunks covered with soot and ash because of the British Industrial Revolution. Some fruit flies have been found to be immune to the pesticide DDT, and later in Northern California, some fruit flies were found to be larger. Viruses have been found to mutate, and some bacteria have an immunity to antibiotics. Between 1950 and 1990, a number of claims were made that fossils were the best, if not the only, direct proof for Darwin's story. The area of science that observes the progress of evolution is paleontology, the study of fossils, and it presents evolution as a visible fact. Fossils provide the only historical evidence that life evolved from simpler to more complex forms. Fossils have yielded virtually everything known about the evolution of plants and animals. Evolution is revealed only through fossil forms, and only paleontology provides evidence for it. Fossils provide the hard evidence that evolution has occurred. After Mendal's research on genetics was published in 1866, the next genetic breakthrough came in 1953 with Crick and Watson's discovery of the DNA double helix structure. As the Darwinian change mechanism was switched to genetic mutation, the question arose as to how new genetic information could be randomly and naturally produced. It was imagined that if you have enough time, fortunate chance might eventually deliver a beneficial mutation. If you had enough monkeys typing long enough, they could produce the works of Shakespeare. Nobody knows who first imagined Shakespeare's monkeys, but it was cited in the early 20th century by Emile Borel and Sir Arthur Eddington to illustrate timescales implied within statistical mechanics. This scenario became the infinite monkey theorem, and it has continued to appear in public school textbooks. Richard Dawkins presented a form of this argument in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, in which he created a computer program that eventually generated his target phrase, "Methinks it is like a weasel." Eventually, coded portions of DNA strands from various life forms were compared in the hope that this might identify evolutionary relationships. Soon, evolutionists were telling the public that human and chimp DNA were 98% similar, proving that humans and chimps evolved from a common ancestor. DNA, natural selection, fossils, and all of these other proofs, Darwinism is true. End of story. Darwin's new story for life began as a needed reaction to Plato's misguided notion that there was no biological variation after creation, but it went against what was already known about fossils and lacked understanding about genetics and the limits of variation. Darwin created a plausible-sounding fiction that pleased those who wanted to contradict biblical ideas, but secular intellectuals sold their souls for an imaginary scenario that has continually shown itself to be out of touch with accumulating evidence. The major elements and the overstated circumstantial proofs that were developed to promote Darwin's story have not stood the test of time very well. Well, when Darwin published The Origin of Species, Mendal's research on genetics was not yet published. So a giraffe stretching its neck slightly and passing that physical change on to offspring that continue the process for many generations sounded plausible. Problem was, it just did not work.
Whoops.
Those kinds of physical changes are not passed on to offspring. If dad breaks a leg or loses an eye before conceiving children, they will not be born with his limp and will probably have 2 functional eyes because they inherit his genes, not his boo-boos. Cultural groups that stretch lips, earlobes, and necks have to do so to each generation of children because these physical changes in parents are not passed on to offspring. The reason Darwinists switched their change mechanism in the 1930s and 40s was not because they found something better, but because inherited adaptation did not work, and Mendal's research explained why. Only genetic information is inherited by offspring. The replacement change mechanism, beneficial random mutation, was based to some degree on Hermann Muller's 1920s experiments bombarding fruit flies with X-rays, which did produce changes, but they were not improvements. Muller's radiation experiments did produce extra wings and legs, but in the wrong places and with no muscles attached, so they actually got in the way of the functional ones. Legs grew where antennae should be, and Muller also got a lot of blind and dead fruit flies. That is the element of Muller's experiments that tends to be ignored. After retiring from Cornell University, geneticist J.C. Sanford emphasized what most first-year biology students learn. Mutations are rare. When they do occur, most are neutral and do not change the life form. Those which are not neutral tend to be harmful, rendering the life form less fit, unable to reproduce, and often dead. Beneficial mutations are so rare that geneticists still have not seen one, and they are not even charted. Consider this interesting comment from noted evolutionary biologist Lynn Margulis.
Darwinists say that new species emerge when mutations occur and modify an organism. I was taught, over and over again, that the accumulation of random mutations led to evolutionary change, led to new species. I believed it until I looked for evidence.
Without a credible change mechanism, it is no wonder that evolutionists have portrayed natural selection as all that is needed to transform protozoa into people. But that is like saying that a quality control person is all you need to come up with new products. No need for designers, factory buildings, material suppliers, or people and machines to actually fabricate and assemble those products. Natural selection refers only to nature sorting out the fit from the unfit. It does not explain how the fit and unfit forms came about in the first place. As for evidence for evolution outside your window, I think these guys need to clean their windows. While Ernst Haeckel was more zealous for promoting Darwinism than scientific integrity, he claimed his embryo drawings looked almost identical because they were repeating their evolutionary history from a common ancestor. Actually, it was due to his dishonest artwork, making them look more similar than they really do. Other embryologists recognized the fraud and called him on it the year they were published. Haeckel admitted the fraud in a 1919 German science journal. Photographs of the actual embryos show how much he fudged the drawings to promote his story. Although known to be bogus for well over a century, the story and the drawings have continued to appear in textbooks. Comparative anatomy, or homology, was built on the same assumption as Haeckel's embryo myth, the belief that similar structures indicate a shared common ancestor. However, it was later learned that similar structures do not always come from the same genetic pathway. From a design perspective, similarity can also indicate the reality that certain basic structural formats just work better in a given environment, and designers reuse the most functional structures and systems. Every automobile is built on the same format, either a frame or unibody with 4 wheels. because it works best, but it is not proof that they all come from the same factory, because we know they do not. When it comes to taxonomy charts, artwork is not evidence, but an artificial visual portrayal of an idea. A foundational problem for Darwinism is that while essential to the story, the crucial common ancestor branching points and the intermediate transitional forms between the branching points and the real known life forms at the end of the branches are phantoms. They are critters required by the theory, but they are not found in the fossils. The cheerleaders say there's lots of them, but paleontologists have known from before Darwin's time that they're just not there. This is what concerned Darwin in 1859, and Stephen Jay Gould was admitting a century later. The trees that adorn our textbooks only have evidence at the ends of the branches. This is why branching tree charts rarely identify the imagined common ancestor, and are all ink until you get to the end of the branches. The common ancestors and the intermediate transitional forms are imagined, but there's very little evidence for any of them. Vestigial organs once imagined between 86 and 180 were another just-so story based on the assumption that Darwinism was true. However, those big early lists were rooted in imaginative wishful thinking and excessive zeal to promote the mythology, along with ignorance of current function. Over time, it was found that many of these alleged vestiges do perform current and even essential functions. An internet search on October 26, 2018 found many articles still promoting vestigial organs as proof for evolution, but the examples cited had dwindled from 180 to between 5 and 10. Darwin's Galapagos finches demonstrate variation, but their beaks are not changing in a linear evolutionary fashion. Instead, the beaks are cycling back and forth according to climate and food supply, and the birds remain finches. Well, it turns out that the British peppered moth did not evolve a new color after all, so as to better hide on tree trunks. Both color varieties were there all along. All the change was the ratio of light and dark varieties. Dead moths were glued on a tree for the test and a picture. Sometimes evolution needs a little help. Fruit flies immune to DDT are a variation, but they are still visually identical to the non-immune. Slightly larger fruit flies are a variation, but not a new kind of insect. Darwinism asserts that variation accumulated to produce transformation. Protozoa were gradually changed structurally into pikes and pythons, parakeets, pachyderms, and people. There is no proof of transformation in any of these. As for the mutating viruses and bacteria with an immunity to antibiotics, mutated viruses are still viruses, and bacteria immune to antibiotics are still bacteria. The claim that fossils prove Darwinism is usually made by zealous evolutionists trained in some field other than paleontology or the study of fossils. With such a claim, you would expect the Earth's strata to be full of intermediate transitional fossil forms, showing earlier life forms being gradually transformed into new and different body plans, and new major groups arising from earlier major groups at different times. In reality, fossils have long been one of Darwinism's biggest problems, and Charles Darwin himself was quite honest about the problem and how serious a threat it posed to his theory. His concerns were expressed in Chapter 9 of The Origin of Species. Geological strata are not filled with fossil evidence for intermediate transitional life forms in the process of gradual transformation, and the major groups of life forms did appear distinct and fully formed at about the same time.
Darwin expressed consternation that every geological formation and every stratum were not filled with intermediate links. Geology does not reveal the finely graduated organic chain he imagined. he acknowledged the abrupt manner in which whole groups of species suddenly appear, and the problem created if numerous species, belonging to the same genera or families really started into life all at once. Darwin noted some critics of his theory, with better science credentials and familiar with the fossil problem, Agassiz, Pictet, and Sedgwick. He realized that this fossil problem was the most obvious and gravest objection that could be urged against his theory, a fatal objection to the belief in the transmutation of species, fatal to the theory of descent with slow modification through natural selection, and a valid argument against the views here entertained. 60 years later, in the 1920s, Austin Clarke, Harvard-trained zoologist and curator of the Smithsonian's Invertebrate Museum, admitted that the fossil record looks like animal life, appeared in essentially the same form as we see it now. As for the appearance of the major groups of animals, the creationist view better represents the evidence. There is not the slightest evidence that any of the major groups arose from any other. In a later review of his work, it was clear that Clarke saw the evidence as pointing to the seemingly simultaneous appearance of all of the phyla or major groups of animals. George Gaylord Simpson, perhaps the most influential paleontologist of the 20th century, noted that every paleontologist is aware that most new species, genera, families, and everything above, appear in the fossil record suddenly, and are not led up to, by gradual, continuous, transitional, intermediate fossil sequences. Simpson also noted that transitions between major levels of life forms are seldom recorded by fossils, a systematic deficiency in the record. As for transitional forms, there are none between or linking phyla. The fossil record is full of gaps. In 1977, Stephen Jay Gould said that Darwin and Lyell were not the heroes of true science. Paleontologists have paid a high price, covering up for the errors in Darwin's argument. Evolution by natural selection is so absent from the fossil record that paleontologists never see the process they claim they are studying. The extreme rarity of transitional forms is the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary tree charts in textbooks the fossils only at the ends of the branches, the rest of the tree is inference, not something observed in the fossil record. Although Darwin's story persists, most paleontologists are embarrassed that the fossil record shows so little evidence for evolution. In 1982, Niles Eldredge and Ian Tattersall noted that paleontologists were not seeing the gradual change Darwin predicted they would find as they moved upward through geological strata. Fossils show that life forms remain recognizably the same throughout their occurrence in the fossil record, and this was known long before Darwin's time. 120 years later, it is clear that the fossil record will not confirm Darwin's prediction, because he was wrong. The observation that species remain the same over long periods has all the qualities of the emperor's new clothes. Everyone knew it, but ignored it, and paleontologists simply looked the other way. Writing in the November 1992 Scientific American, Jeffrey S. Leventon noted that the body plans that appeared in the Cambrian are blueprints for those seen today. Few, or no, new ones have appeared since then. All evolutionary changes, since the Cambrian, are mere variations, as there was an explosion of complex life near the beginning of the Cambrian. J. Madeline Nash, writing in the December 4, 1995 Time magazine, noted the abrupt appearance of animals that are the ancestors of almost all current life forms. There was a burst of creativity, like nothing before or since, providing the blueprints for the whole of the animal kingdom, an explosion of biological diversity. The evidence indicates that this period of biological innovation occurred at virtually the same instant, all around the world.
Genesis 1 described an orchard of major groups of life forms appearing at about the same time, but Darwin argued for a single tree of life, with lots of intermediate fossil forms showing gradual transformation and major group branches appearing at different times. What do the fossils look like? The imagined intermediate transitional fossils are missing, and the major groups all appeared at about the same time. Darwin was wrong. Some were concerned enough about the fossil problem to offer an alternative, The geneticist R.B. Goldschmidt suggested that life forms sail along unchanged for long periods, but then a sudden beneficial mega mutation occurs, like a lizard lays an egg and a bird steps out. Stephen Jay Gould picked up the hopeful monster or punctuated equilibrium idea, but even he could not sell it. Since most Darwinists were gradualists, he took a lot of heat and backed off. Darwinism has a problem. The fossils do not look like gradualism occurred, and genetics do not make new body plans by sudden mega mutation, very likely. It was optimistically imagined that over deep time, fortunate chance might eventually deliver beneficial mutations, like enough monkeys typing long enough could eventually produce the works of Shakespeare. This is like blow up enough junkyards and you will eventually get the pieces to fall together to form a functional Boeing 747 airliner. The anti-God folks believe passionately in unlikely things and miracles. The only difference is that the miracle workers they worship are named Father Time and Mother Nature. Nickname, Chance. Eventually, a British zoo decided to let the monkeys have a go at producing some literature, placing a computer and a keyboard in their living space. But sadly, not a single Shakespearean sonnet was produced, not even a sentence or a phrase. Instead, they typed the same 3 letters many times and repeatedly subjected the keyboard to large doses of urine and feces, perhaps a needed commentary on this foolishness. As for Dawkins, a brilliant man designing a computer program that will deliver a short predetermined target phrase, seems like a better argument for intelligent design than random unguided chance. There's no natural process that produces even simple and error-filled computer code. Bill Gates once noted that DNA is like computer code, but way beyond what humans have produced. But we're supposed to believe that DNA originated from some blind natural process? No wonder these guys, including Dawkins, have seriously suggested that a distant civilization of intelligent aliens, for which there is no evidence, engineered life and planted it here on Earth. They're fine with imagined intelligent designers, as long as it's not God. Does that tell you anything? DNA comparisons indicate that humans and chimps are only 2% different. Really? It is easy to distinguish humans and chimps in real life because we are not 98% similar in appearance, shape, structure, size, intelligence, and so on. And then there were things the public was not told. The 98% similarity study was made with sections selected because they were already noticed to be similar. Comparing larger sections, the similarity drops into the 80th percentile. When similar sections of coded human DNA are compared to other life forms, we find that humans and yeast are 32 to 50% similar, humans and cats, 60%, humans and pumpkins, 71%, humans and mice, 92 to 99%. Bottom line, there is a lot more than similar portions of coded DNA distinguishing the various structures of life forms. And there are large portions of human DNA that do not encode proteins. In the 1960s, it was dismissed as junk DNA, leftover pieces thought to have no current function. However, ongoing research has identified current functions for at least 80% of what used to be dismissed as junk. No wonder coded DNA similarities do not seem like enough to account for the obvious differences between chimps and humans. There is more to DNA than the coded sections. Rudyard Kipling wrote a collection of just so stories to help parents explain unexplainable things to children, how the elephant got its trunk, how the leopard got its spots, and so on. Each story began with an imagined original condition, then spun plausible-sounding imaginary tales that concluded with the currently observed reality. Leading evolutionists Richard Lewontin and Stephen Jay Gould have admitted that the popular evolutionary scenario includes a lot of unsupported just-so stories. Artwork can portray whatever the mind imagines and the heart believes, from evidence-based reality to pure imaginary fantasy. Visual images are powerful, which is why they're used in politics, education, advertising, science, mythology, and humor. Over the years, when evidence was absent or weak, artwork has been the primary tool for portraying Darwinian concepts. Darwin's gradually branching tree of life, human evolution from an ape-like ancestor, and life from non-life. People see the artwork portrayed as science, are told these concepts are confirmed by overwhelming evidence and that all scientists and educated people believe it, and they follow along. Since Darwin first published The Origin of Species, there have been serious reasons to doubt his scenario. First, there is the ongoing fossil problem. The imagined intermediate transitional fossils are extremely rare and systematically missing, while it looks like the major groups of life forms appeared at about the same time. This has been repeatedly affirmed. In 1859, Agassiz, Pictet, Sedgwick, and Charles Darwin knew it. In the 1920s, Austin H. Clarke. In the 1950s, George Gaylord Simpson. In the 1970s, Stephen Jay Gould. 1980s, Niles Eldridge and Ian Tattersall. 1990s, J. Madeline Nash affirmed it in a Time magazine article. Second, there is the change mechanism problem. How did the alleged Darwinian transformation of protozoa into all other body formats actually take place? Darwin imagined unlimited minor variation accumulating to produce transformation and borrowed Lamarck's notion of inherited adaptation. However, just a few years later, Mendal demolished the central premise of Darwin's scenario, demonstrating that there are distinct genetic limits to variation, and only genetic information is passed on to offspring, invalidating Lamarck's inherited adaptation notion. The 1980 Chicago Conference concluded that minor variations probably did not accumulate to produce transformation, thus denying a core Darwinian concept. Inherited adaptation had to be dropped because it did not work. So in the 1930s and 40s, random beneficial mutation was adopted as its replacement. But it was not long before scientists in various fields began asking the obvious questions. How common are beneficial mutations, and how likely is this to have turned protozoa into people? This concern led to the 1966 conference at the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia, then in the early 1970s to a meeting in the Vienna home of MIT physicist Victor Weisskopf. Murray Eden, also of MIT, ran the statistics for known mutation rates and declared that a 4.6 billion-year-old Earth did not provide nearly enough time, statistically, for Darwinism to have occurred. However, those desperate to preserve Darwinism have boldly imagined and portrayed mutations as a benevolent miracle worker capable of transforming protozoa into people. But every biology student learns that mutations are rare, and when they occur, they are neutral and make no change, or negative, rendering the life form less fit, unable to reproduce, or dead. Upon hearing that their child has a genetic mutation, also known as birth defect, parents do not get excited that their child will be a new and improved human, brilliant, super athlete, or the next Beethoven. Instead, they properly imagine deformity or essential parts not functioning as well as they should. That's how mutations work. The noted evolutionary biologist Ernst Haeckel asserted that Darwin produced embarrassingly little concrete evidence to back up some of his most important claims, and that he actually did not have a single clear-cut piece of evidence for the existence of natural selection. In 1966, the author of my college zoology textbook, Paul B. Weitz, admitted that after a century, the evidence for Darwin's story is still murky enough that he was only sure of the general scenario, that animal groups evolved in some phylogenetic pattern. And Jonathan Weiner noted that Darwin's Origin of Species did not really document the origin of a single species. The cover of the January 2009 New Scientist journal said it quite plainly. Darwin was wrong. Evolutionists have admitted that Darwinism was widely and quickly embraced and then never seriously questioned since then. Aren't all scientific explanations supposed to be open to continuing criticism and revisited occasionally to see if there are problems or new evidence perspectives? In The Demon-Haunted World, Carl Sagan painted a very positive picture of science, a focus on the facts, even when they don't conform to our preconceptions, to carry alternative hypotheses in our heads and see which best fit the facts, openness to new ideas, however heretical. Science works well because of its built-in error-correcting machinery. There are no forbidden questions in science, no matters too sensitive or delicate to be probed, no sacred truths, skeptical scrutiny of all ideas. We are aware that revered scientists have been wrong. We are constantly challenging, seeking contradictions or small, persistent residual errors, proposing alternative explanations, encouraging heresy. That sounds great, and these are the noble ideas that I was taught. But while science is ideally portrayed as open-minded, welcoming all questions and criticisms in search of the truth, I found reality to be less noble. There is a growing collection of documented cases in which openly expressing doubts about the general evolutionary scenario, Darwinism in particular, or even just admitting that there are some problems, have led to censure, dismissal from faculty or administrative positions, and even the threat of taking away an earned doctoral degree for not using it to promote Darwinism. That did not sound to me like science, but an ideological orthodoxy that, like dogma, people are expected to believe without question. Well, that forces me to ask this question. Was Darwinism formulated, embraced quickly, confidently promoted, and has been protected from criticism for some reason other than its scientific merits? I believe it was. The men of the Enlightenment and modern era wanted nature stories that could be portrayed as reason and science explanations, would eliminate God from reality, contradict biblical ideas, and help to move Western civilization from biblical theism to atheism. Darwinism provided a plausible-sounding secular story for life's diversity, and even with serious defects, those primarily concerned with eradicating supernaturalism have and will continue defending it to their dying day. For secularists, Darwinism is too big to fail. Accordingly, Darwin's wreck sails on. What are problems for Darwin's story are quite compatible with Genesis. Observation and evidence indicate that life always comes from a prior living source. Cellular life is complex. It looks designed for a purpose, and its processes are driven by complex coded information. There are genetic limits on variation, and fossils look like the major groups of life forms appeared distinct and fully formed at about the same time. In view of these things, I could no longer embrace the Darwinian scenario as good science.